Hello, everybody. Is this working? Can anybody hear me? Yes, you can. Good. This is very strange for me. This is the first time I've done anything like this. I see Cindy says you can see me and you can hear me as well. Well, that's good. That's good. Um, well, welcome. We've got a handful of people online. That's great. I said this is the first time I've done anything like this, so I'm a little bit nervous, but also don't quite know what to do. So mainly what I've done is I've got a set of slides ready, but mainly I've also got some text, which I wasn't confident about just speaking off the top of my head. So I've got some text here, which I'm going to base a lot of what I'm going to say on. So please do excuse me if I seem to be looking down quite a lot of the time. So hello everybody. My name is Dr. Geraint Wyn Story. But it's much easier to call me Gez, and I'm a research and development consultant at the University of Cambridge. And I also run my own freelance training company called Cambridge Training Associates here in the UK. What I'm going to talk about in this session is the challenges in graduate studies. And by that, I mean, what are the difficulties that people experience when they do a PhD or a master's degree? Oh, I see Cindy's just said, are you recording the talk? I don't know if I am. What do I need to do, Cindy, if I need to record the talk? Is there something, is there a button I need to press? Just wait for a response from Cindy. Okay, I'll just carry on anyway, I think. There should be a button, but I don't know. Is it the YouTube button? I see there's a YouTube button. Maybe, the YouTube video player. Maybe that's it. Nope, not that one. Never mind. Anyway, I think we can go on anyway, and maybe you can send me more questions if there's things you have to answer or things we can send. Fozia says, can we record it? By all means, if you want to record it, do. I don't know how to, but maybe we could do it again in future and record it, so you can watch it again and again if you want. What's the best thing to do? Should we just carry on? I don't think I can figure out how to record it, but I'll just carry on. Okay, what I'm going to talk about in this session is based on my own experience that has involved a master's degree in the University of Manchester, a PhD in the University of Cambridge, a 2-year spell in the biotech industry, and also nearly 6 years as a coordinator of professional development for PhD students in Cambridge. Now, if I cast my mind way back, I can remember applying to do the PhD in Cambridge and honestly hadn't really thought about the realities and demands of the PhD. I remember having my interview and was really focused on the sorts of questions that they might ask me. Why did I want to do a PhD? What knowledge had I accumulated during my undergrad and through my master's? And had I read the papers related to the project that I wanted to take on? But the scale of these things hadn't really dawned on me at all until about 5 minutes after I got the phone call to tell me that they wanted to offer me a place. And this is where maybe some of you are now. Some of you may be thinking about applying to do a PhD. Some of you may be in the process of applying, and some of you may be in the fortunate position of having been offered a place or already have a place. So I hope you are going to identify a little bit with what I'm saying. So when I finished the phone call, I remember getting a sinking feeling, thinking about the magnitude of the task in front of me, already getting the imposter syndrome kicking in. Imposter syndrome is the feeling that many PhD students get when they think they're not good enough to be doing a PhD. They think everyone else is more clever than they are, that there must have been some terrible mistake when they were accidentally let into the university. Well, that's a very normal thing, and many others feel exactly the same. So the way I was feeling after I got the phone call after offering me the place on the PhD course, and the way that many people, when they get a bit of the imposter syndrome, is that I wasn't clever enough, I wasn't intelligent enough, and that I didn't have enough knowledge. Oh, my slides aren't changing. Am I going to have to do this manually? Okay, there we go. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about during this session is that there are many challenges during your PhD. However, your intelligence and your knowledge, in my opinion, are not the biggest of these challenges. If you have your master's degree or a decent upper second class degree, and I'm talking about the sort of grades that I know in the UK, it means that you are intelligent enough. And as for knowledge, well, you can acquire knowledge pretty quickly. In my experience of doing a PhD and my experience of working with PhD students to support their professional development for nearly 6 years, I know that there are many bigger challenges, and that the difficulty of these challenges is, first of all, that most people don't anticipate them. They cannot be solved through standard routes of teaching and learning, and that the nature of challenges will be different for every PhD student. So I'm going to discuss some of these challenges and also some of the ways in which you can meet them. Now, I hear all sorts of individual problems that PhD students face, but in my experience, these challenges are related to 3 main areas: project management, communication, and working with their supervisor. And you might recognize the cartoon down there. That's a cartoon from Jorge Cham, who writes PhD comics. And he's a really nice guy. He's come over to speak with us a few times. I recommend looking up those comics. Anyway, so the first challenge that I'm going to talk about is probably the biggest and the broadest and the most common challenge that I hear PhD students talking about. And it can manifest itself in all sorts of different ways. And this problem, as I've put on the screen there, is project management. Now, first of all, I should give you a little bit of context about what most PhDs are like, and you may well know this already yourself, and I do base this on what I know in the UK system. You will have a question to answer, or a hypothesis to prove or to test, which is often vague, and you are actually probably going to change that question and that hypothesis as you go along. You also have about 3 or 4 years to get it done. You've got some pretty loose rules and guidelines and a supervisor to guide you through. And that's about it. The nature of a PhD is really freedom to pursue various avenues of interest without too much pressure. Now, some of these things that I say here might seem a little bit controversial, and there may be some people who disagree with me. I'm going to say them anyway. I said that a PhD is really freedom without too much pressure, because the central premise of a PhD is that it's a training in research. A training in research. You are learning how to be a good researcher. Now, a question for you, and feel free to type your answers on the screen if you want. A question for you is, how many publications do you need to get a PhD in the UK? Think about that for a moment. How many publications do you need to get a PhD in the UK? 0 to 3, says Cindy. Any other thoughts? Okay, 4. Well, the answer is, well, yeah, well done, Ile. The answer is you don't need any. Now, this is because in the UK, at least, a PhD is not an exercise in publishing. It is a training in research. Now, this is where people often disagree with me, because they say you must publish. Now, I'm not saying don't publish. Publishing is a good thing. And it's a good thing if you want to be an academic. And it's a good thing because it shows that you're getting data and that the PhD is on course. And if you've got a couple of research papers published during your PhD, the chances are that you are going to have a good amount of positive data to write in your dissertation. And that is often one of the biggest worries for students. However, what I'm saying is that if you have no publications, you can still get a PhD. If you have all negative data, you can still get a PhD, providing that the negative data is negative results from good science rather than poor science and poor experimental design. That will not get you a PhD. And this is where a PhD differs to a postdoc. Someone who takes up a postdoc is usually looking at progressing through the academic career. And the currency here, the sign of your quality and your performance, is your publishing record. Where you publish and how much you publish. A balance of quality and quantity. And this means that postdoc projects are often a little bit safer because the people who take them on want to be able to publish. The difference with a PhD is that there isn't quite the same pressure, and this means that PhD projects can often be a little bit more risky than what they're trying to achieve, more novel, and sometimes a bit more wacky, and that actually is a good thing for the world of research. However, getting back to my original point of the challenges that PhD students face and the challenge of project management, it is precisely these wonderful characteristics of a PhD that let you take on chances, let you pursue interesting avenues, and give you the freedom of the time available. It is these characteristics that make a PhD an absolute bugger of a thing to project manage. The openness of the subject often leads to a lack of clear direction. The long deadline often leads to a lack of productivity. The consequences of these can be that motivation drops. And often self-confidence drops as well, because the nature of the academic hierarchy means that you will be bottom of the pile. So this is where project management comes into it. And my first recommendation for you is planning. Now, a common reaction I get to my recommendation of planning is, well, what's the point? It's so early in my PhD that many things are going to change, and I don't yet have my question pinned down. Well, here's a good quote from for you. I'll just click onto my next slide. This is from Dwight Eisenhower. He said, "In my experience of going into battle, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable." I'll just let you have a think about that for a moment. Now, what I take from his quote is that although many things will change, planning makes you better prepared for dealing with those changes. So don't be put off from planning. Planning can mean many things, but for me, the easiest way to think what your overall objective is, that's what you should do. Think about, well, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? For instance, the question that you're trying to address. And you can then begin breaking things down by asking the question, well, for that to happen, what else needs to happen? And then for that to happen, what needs to happen before that? And you can keep going. And you can use this, even if it's a small objective, such as defining the research question. You can then look at what the deadline is for that objective, and then start mapping out on a calendar or diary the time needed and the scheduling of all the subtasks that you've come up with, until you get down to what needs doing this week and what needs doing today, which brings you right down to a to-do list. Now, my reasoning here is that if you know what you are doing today contributes towards the week, and the week contributes towards the overall objective, it will be likely to keep you motivated and productive. You can leave your studies at the end of the day having ticked off what you've done that day and knowing what it is that you need to do tomorrow. And this can help you feel in control as well, knowing if you are on track or not, knowing whether you can accept new work or ideas, or if you just need to ignore the distractions that are going on. And if you know that you're on track, that's great. But if you're falling behind, you can reassess the objective and rework your plans. Maybe they were too ambitious, or maybe you'll know that you'll need an extension or more financial support. And showing evidence that you've planned these things through will put you in a much better position to be able to ask for that extension or for that extra money. Now let me just get through my paperwork. Okay. Now many of the challenges of project management are related to time management, and it's quite difficult to separate them out. I talked about the long deadline, the uncertain objective, and the freedom you have with your time. And the usual consequence is that productivity is pretty low. But I want to make it clear that this is usually not a consequence of laziness. Most PhD students are actually not lazy. Most work long hours and often 6 out of 7 days a week, certainly towards the end of the PhD. So what we need to separate here is the difference between activity and productivity. Activity is busyness, filling your time by doing things. However, productivity is the act of doing things that actually contribute to what you want to achieve. You can work 14-hour days, 6 days a week, which makes you feel that you're working hard and your supervisor is pleased. But if you made sure you were doing the right things properly and efficiently, you may be able to work half those hours and have time to relax properly and enjoy your evenings and weekends so you can actually return to work refreshed and motivated. I'll give you an example of a friend of mine through my PhD. He was in the year ahead of me, and he would come in at about 9:30 in the morning during the week. Not that early really, but he would work until about 8 o'clock every evening. And he would go in a bit later on a Saturday, maybe at about 11 o'clock with the newspaper, and being a bit more relaxed, but he'd be there until the early evening. And on a Sunday night, if I had to pop in to set up a bacteria culture for the next day or something, he would be there as well. And I thought to myself, this is the hardest working PhD student I know. Then he came to do his PhD viva, which is the exam that you have at the end of the PhD after 3.5 years, and he failed. And he was sent back to the lab to do another 3 months of lab work and write that into his dissertation. And I was shocked. And I was shocked because I had seen him working so hard. And what I came to realize was that he was really putting the hours in. There was an awful lot of activity, but there clearly was not productivity. There comes a point when you work so much, especially with lab work, you begin to make mistakes, you get jaded, and you lose your motivation and lose sight of your objectives. And this is where it's critical to revisit the things that I mentioned a little earlier, and the planning and the replanning, keeping your objectives and tasks in sight so you are doing the right things. But this is one of the big dangers of a PhD, because you can work long hours. You don't have to go home at 5 o'clock, and you do work late, and this is often because there's been a lot of time wasting and procrastination during the day, because you can work late. But I've known a few PhD students who are parents, and they have to leave early to look after their family. And the amazing thing is that they often get the PhD done earlier than the students who don't have family to look after. They have learned to be productive with the time that they do have. So in the hours that they are there, they're much more productive. So in many ways, the freedom that you have creates an unproductive working style. Now, many students have come from an undergraduate style of working, i.e. be here, do this, sit this exam, etc. You know where you need to be and what you need to be doing all the time. But all that structure has gone in the PhD. And most PhD students are actually crying out for a bit of structure to the work, but nobody is going to give it to you. You are going to have to do that yourself. Now, there's a psychometric tool called Myers-Briggs type indicator, which I'm not going to go into in any detail here, but you can find out a lot more about it online if you want to at some other time. But one of the things that Myers-Briggs talks about is that some people have a preference for being organized and orderly with their approach to life, and some people have a preference to be more spontaneous, reacting to things as they go along. Now, as a PhD student, you will need to make the best of both of those ways of working. Neither is better or worse. But if you only behave according to one of those preferences, you will encounter problems. You need to be able to use both of those preferences to make your PhD work. So to repeat, that's the theory that some people have a preference for being organized and orderly with their approach to life, and some people have a preference to being more spontaneous, reacting to things as they go along. This idea comes from Myers-Briggs type indicator, which there is an awful lot more to than what I've just mentioned. So please do look into that if you're interested, or feel free to contact me afterwards. Now, from my experience of working on time management with PhD students, one of the biggest sort of aha moments comes when I explain to students a technique for how to prioritize. There are so many things that you have to do. You have to decide, well, what's most important? What do I actually need to do? What can I sort of leave? And the key here is to be able to distinguish between what is urgent and what's important. So first of all, I'm just going to put a question to you again. I'd like you to take a few moments to think about if you can decide what makes something urgent or what makes something important. So feel free to type on the chat room if you want. What makes something urgent? What makes something important? Have you got any ideas? Are you all asleep? Okay, nothing coming in at the moment. But let me talk about that. With urgent things have a time element to them. There is a deadline. They must be dealt with immediately. We've got something. Example of urgent, bacterial subculture. Yeah, because there's an element of time there. That's right. There is a deadline which you have to meet. Now, urgent things don't always have a high payoff, but often get priority over important jobs and are often unplanned. We actually have no indication of whether they are important or not. Now, so there's been some ideas there about what things are urgent. So urgency just has a sense of time. Cindy's put importance, submitting monthly report to supervisor. But what makes it important? Why is it important? Important things are important because they're things that help you achieve your overall purpose, such as getting a PhD. Important is always important. Important things must be given attention and done well. Now, a common mistake for PhD students is not distinguishing between urgent and important. We tend to spend a lot of our lives doing the urgent things and putting off the important things. And this is exactly what happens in a lot of the average day during a PhD. The best part of the day is taken up with the urgent things. And finally, at the end of the day, when they can't be put off any longer, the important things are done, like writing or the critical experiment that you need to do. Or, as Cindy says, important submitting the monthly report to the supervisor. Now, this can be compared to the Pareto principle. So I haven't written that on my slides, but the Pareto principle, that's P-A-R-E-T-O. Maybe I can write it in the line here. Pareto. And this is also known as the 80-20 principle, where there's a generalization that we spend 80% of our time doing things that only provide 20% of our results. Now we need to shift that rule around. Sometimes people feel that they do the best work later at night. And while this may be true because there are fewer distractions, it's often because the important things have just been put back. Now this leads to very long working days that I described, and then subsequently late mornings, maybe get into a vicious cycle. But you may be thinking, hang on, some things can be both urgent and important. And yes, they can. So a way to help order one's time and prioritize is to make a matrix of urgent and important. And I've got that on a slide here. So we're looking at prioritizing the ability to tell the difference between what's urgent and important, and that you can actually make a matrix. So the matrix there has things which are urgent and important, things which are important but not urgent but not important, and then not urgent and not important. So for things that are both important and urgent, what do you think the response should be? What should your action be? Feel free to type it there if you want. If something is important and urgent, like Cindy said, submitting the monthly report to the supervisor. Let's give you a moment or two to respond to that. Is anybody going to put anything? What should your action be? Do it as a daily task? Well, the response that I've got here is do it now. If something is important and urgent, do it now. And if something is important and not urgent, so it has to be done because it's important, but there's not that same time element, the response should be plan time. Put it in your diary, put it in your calendar for when it is that you're going to do it. And the next thing is, if something is urgent, as in it needs doing, it's a time demand, but it's not that important, the response is do it in your low quality time. And by that, I sort of mean maybe your time after lunch, when your brain's not quite as effective as it should be. And when your brain's not effective, maybe it's not good to take on the big important tasks. So you can gather those little tasks together and do them in your low quality time. And then finally, if something is not urgent and not important, what do you think the response should be there? It's not urgent and not important. Postpone. Yeah, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good response. The response is leave it. Absolutely. And it's certainly the response you should take maybe as you're getting towards the end of your PhD. However, the problem with things that are not urgent and not important is that these are usually the things that make life worth living. You could say that actually you need to organize the rest of your time so you do have time for those things. What I'd like you to do is think of an example of something that may be in the do it now category. Something in the do it now category, the urgent and important. Cindy already put submitting a monthly report to the supervisor in the urgent and important. Any other thoughts on examples of things that are urgent and important? I'll just give you a second or two to type. Anything coming through? Breathing, yeah, absolutely. Urgent and important. You don't want to put this off. Talk to supervisor consistently. Publish my research work. Now, I think they're good examples, and I think on the whole they're good examples. Deadlines for submitting the application paper, yeah, they're good, because when I ask this question to PhD students normally, the examples I get are the sorts of similar things that you've talked about. A presentation for a conference, a job application deadline, and as Geraint has said, class preparation for tomorrow. And they are excellent answers, and I really love these answers because they're wrong. Now, I will need to have a think for a moment about why class preparation for tomorrow, deadline for submitting the application, or submitting the supervisor report for tomorrow. Why is it wrong that they are important and urgent? Any thoughts on that? I'll see if any answers pop up. But I'll put you right your measure. The answer is it's wrong because although those things, yeah, they shouldn't be done at the last moment. It says it's because it's urgent but not so important. The answer is because they are urgent and important now, but there was a time when they were important but not urgent. with all of them, such as the deadline for the report or the presentation that needs doing, they were always important, but they weren't always urgent. So they should have been in the plan time. You should have factored time into your diary or your calendar when you can do those things. Things which are in the important and urgent, the do it now category, should never be seen coming. There should be things that just completely out of the blue that you weren't expecting. The problem is most of the things we do actually end up in the important and urgent thing, and we end up firefighting, we're reacting all the time. So if you can actually plan your time better, get those important and not urgent things done in an orderly sort of fashion, it helps you feel much more in control of your time. So you can then deal with the urgent and important things that you weren't expecting to come along. Okay, so as I was saying, only unforeseen things should be important and urgent. If things can be planned, they should never be important and urgent. So you aim to move things from important and urgent to important and not urgent by planning and project management. Okay, the next thing that I want to talk about in this look at project management is that usually in working life, we know what is required of us and the standard to which it has to be done. And the requirements of postgraduate degrees will vary from institution to institution and country to country. But in the UK, the usual formal requirements are that you have to write a first-year report, so you can actually fully register as a PhD student from your period of probation. You have to submit a dissertation, otherwise known as a thesis, and you have to pass your viva, which is an interview with 2 experts or examiners in your area. So that's quite a short list. But the really tricky thing is to what standard does it have to be, i.e., how good does your PhD need to be? Or how good does your dissertation need to be? Now, I bet you, if you go looking in your institution, you won't find an answer because it's a very subjective process. If universities started being prescriptive about how good it needs to be, they would remove freedom and the creativity that makes PhDs what they are. So again, this adds to the problem of project management. However, there is an answer to the question of how good it needs to be. Does anybody want to have a guess at how good it needs to be? How many are you there? I don't know if how many are there. Any answers to how good a dissertation needs to be? Novelty for a PhD? Any other ideas? I'll put you out of your misery. The answer is that it needs to be good enough. Now, that might seem like, yeah, well done, Harriam, good answer. It needs to be good enough. Now, in the UK, there is no pass, merit, or distinction for a PhD. You get it or you don't. There is no point in making it perfect. You'll find that there are diminishing returns on perfecting a dissertation. And by that, I mean, if you take 3 months to write a dissertation that is good enough, but it won't take 4 months to write the perfect one. It would be more like 6 months. And for what? You might feel better about it because you think it's perfect, but at that stage, you'll be wanting to get finished. You want to move on because your money is running out, and maybe your time is running out. So be aware of the perfect versus good enough. And it needs to be good enough for your examiners. That is the next question. So the obvious question is, how good and good enough for whom? Good enough for you? Good enough for your supervisor? Who? As I said, the answer to this is good enough for your viva examiners. However, you don't really know how good that is because, as I said, it's a subjective process. So the only way that you will find out how good it needs to be is to read the dissertations of people who have passed and talk to examiners. There will be dissertations on the shelf of your PhD supervisor's office, and every single dissertation from your institution will be in the library at your institution. So go and have a look at some of them. And as for the examiners, these people are not from Mars. Most of the academics in the department in which you join will have been a PhD Viva examiner. So go and talk to them about it. Okay, I think I've probably talked enough about project management and used up the best part of this seminar, or this webinar, sorry. But that's because I think it's such a big challenge in postgraduate study that most people don't anticipate. Now, the next two challenges that I see in postgraduate study, I promise that I will just touch on briefly, and I may be able to talk more about them at some point in the future, maybe with another webinar or something. But as I said earlier, learning about a lot of these things is not straightforward. It's not just a matter of listening to someone talk about it. You need to have a go to get the experience and learn from it. And that's experiential learning. Now, the next big challenge that I see many PhD students face is that of communication of research. Most of the time, we do these things totally unconsciously, but to succeed in your PhD, you're going to have to make these things a conscious process. Now, the areas that I want to mention are reading, writing, and presenting as forms of research communication. Now, for example, reading. You're going to have to read massive amounts of material during the PhD, and there really is no end to how much you can read, and I mean that literally. There will be no end to the reading that you could do. So don't just read for the sake of it. This goes back to my discussion about activity and productivity earlier. Just reading is activity. You've got to make sure that your reading is productive. So you need to be strategic about what you read. First of all, how you find your literature or how you get notified about new literature, as well as to make sure that you're up to date. This will come from learning how to use literature searching software properly. Examples of these in the life sciences, for example, are things like PubMed, Scopus, Embase, and Web of Science. Getting training on them is a good idea, so you can use them productively. And once you have your literature, you'll need to file it properly, because you'll accumulate hundreds of papers that you may need to sort through quickly and reference when you write your dissertation. And a good piece of bibliographic software will help you do this. And examples of these are things like EndNote, Zotero, and Mendeley. But again, the key is to get some training on these pieces of software so you can use them properly. A useful feature of some of these pieces of software is that they can help you annotate a paper as you go along. By this, I mean make notes on them as you read. So your notes are filed as you're writing them, as if you would on a paper copy. And this helps with your reading and your reviewing the paper at a later date. So you won't have to reread a whole paper. So if you make good notes, this will help you when you need to include them in your writing. But the most important thing for me is how you go about reading a paper. What is your purpose in reading that paper? So you need to ask yourself every time you read, why am I reading this? And if you don't know, stop reading it and do something more productive. It may be that you want an overview, to know a technique, to see their results, in which case you read in a different way. Scientific papers, for example, are written in different sections. So you may only want to focus on a particular section, or may want to skim read it first to find out if it's worth reading, and then return to the key parts later on and annotate it as you go along. Make notes on the paper. Anyway, I said I would just touch on these areas. So the next aspect that I want to talk about as a challenge in graduate research is writing, which is actually a very difficult and unenjoyable process for most PhD students. But it doesn't have to be like that. The most important thing that I want to say about this is that that most PhD students separate their research from the writing. They are doing their experiments and then they're writing up. But this is really the wrong way to do it. Writing needs to be an integrated part of your weekly work, because writing is thinking. Writing down your thoughts of what you have done and what you're going to do allows you to get all those jumbled thoughts in your head straightened out and on paper for keeping and reading and rereading and letting others have a look at, possibly. And you will get over your fear of writing, get better on it, and actually have a look, also have a lot of your work done when it comes to write a paper or a dissertation. But it does need discipline, because writing is one of those important but not urgent things. So it needs planning and scheduling, or it doesn't get done. And then it becomes urgent and important, and then you find you don't have enough time to do it properly. But some people in Cambridge are now forming writing groups to make writing a social thing with an element of peer pressure, but more peer support. And if you put Cambridge writing groups into Google, you can find out much more about them and how they work. I'll just type that into this line because I think it's worth writing, you finding out about Cambridge writing groups. They've got a Facebook group, but they've also got a web page that explains how they work. Now, the final part of communication that I want to touch on is giving presentations. Now, I could talk for hours about presentations, but I think what I'll do in the interest of time is just mention a couple of concepts that you could follow up if you want to learn more or improve your presentations. The problem with most academic presentations is that they're fairly dull and badly delivered. And focusing on fine detail, not engaging the audience, and often confusing the audience. Now, the two most important concepts that is useful to bear in mind are those of, let me just find my slide, of why, how, and what. And this has been really demonstrated by a guy called Simon Sinek. And he's got a fantastic TED talk on the principles there of how, why, and what. And the principles for researchers are that when people give presentations, we tend to spend far too much time talking about the what we are doing, the fine detail, which are often abstract and complicated. And that is why we lose people when we talk. They lose interest and drift off. We may talk about how we're doing the research, and maybe at the end, people might finally talk about why they're doing it, or maybe the applications. Simon Sinek's suggestion is that we tackle the why first. This makes people realize why our research is important, why they should care, what difference it's going to make to the world. Then when we talk about the how we are doing it, and then specifically what we are doing, and in this way people will listen and engage with the detailed part later on because they understand the point. For instance, if I was studying HIV, I would start by telling an audience about how many people suffer from HIV and AIDS, how awful it is, and the impact on families and communities. Then I talk about the very fine detail of my project, and maybe the proteins in the cells and the transport mechanisms and virus, etc., because they're more likely to listen to that once I've given them the big picture of the why. And this then leads to the second concept that I want to mention that I think is absolutely critical for giving good presentations. And this goes back to Aristotle and ancient Greek. And the principle is of ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is your credibility, establishing yourself as an authority. And this can be done by maybe by saying who you are, who you work for, how long you've worked there, and by dressing appropriately and looking confident, this establishes your credibility. And pathos is the emotional impact that you have on the audience. You want to do something to them. You want them to feel something. Like when I explained the effect of HIV earlier, the audience might feel sympathy or anger, but by the end, they might feel excited by the work. And finally, logos is the logic behind what you're saying. Does it add up? Does it make sense? And was there a narrative? Did it flow? Now, if you can remember the why, how, and what, as well as ethos, pathos, and logos, you can deliver better presentations with or without PowerPoint. Now, the final thing that I'm going to talk about, we are getting towards the end now, is working with your supervisor, the challenge of working with your supervisor. Now, this is the most important relationship that you will have during your PhD. And it's like a marriage. You've got to work at it to make it a success. And many supervisor-student relationships do go sour for all sorts of reasons. So you've got to learn to work in harmony with your supervisor. The first thing that I really recommend is that you and your supervisor should both clarify your expectations. Good relationships will come from both you having the same understanding of what your responsibilities are, like who organizes the meetings between you, who should decide on what research direction to take, how much feedback can you expect. The problem is that every supervisor, every student, and every project is different. So there is no fixed guidelines in this. And this is why I recommend that you establish your particular shared expectations with your supervisor. Now, there's an excellent questionnaire which was written a few years back by Martin, McComb, and Taylor for the Society of Research in Higher Education. I'm just going to put that reference up there for you, and we can have a quick look at it. And the idea is that you and your supervisor would independently complete the questionnaire to understand the positions you have on critical topics. And this is, I'm not going to read every one, but for instance, if you have a look at the top question that's there, this is about topic, course of study. Two different perspectives on the same thing. Is it the supervisor's responsibility to select a promising topic, or it is the student's responsibility to select a promising topic? And what you would do is put a ring around which one you think is right. You might think it's very much the supervisor's responsibility, so you put a 1 around that. But then when your supervisor fills it in, you might have the completely opposite opinion. You might think it's more of a 5 there. But it means that if you understand that difference, you can then have a conversation about it, so you understand each other, getting that cleared up quite early on in the PhD, rather than only finding out that right at the end of the PhD when it's become more of a problem. So, I mean, I'll let you come back to these maybe later on if it's recorded on YouTube, or I could email those questions to you if you think it's useful. But if we flick on to the next slide, if we have a look at the second question there, this is about contact involvement. The supervisor should initiate frequent meetings with the student, or it is up to the student to decide when she wants meetings with the supervisor. Again, neither of those is right, but the most important thing is that you understand what your expectation is and what is that of your supervisor. And this is the final set of questions. We have a look at the second one here again. The supervisor has direct responsibility for the standard of the thesis. That's one view. The other view is the supervisor advises only and leaves all decisions concerning content, format, and standards to the students. They are very, very different approaches to the same thing. But if you have a shared understanding, your relationship can be much more productive. Now, the next few points follow on from the last point. Just get me onto my final slides. It is your PhD, and you must learn to become an independent researcher. Now, you may need a lot of support from your supervisor in the beginning, but you have to become independent quite quickly, especially because when it comes to your PhD writer, your supervisor will not be there to help you in your PhD writer. At that point, you will have to defend your own research. And you also have to be an independent researcher because your supervisor is an extremely busy person whose time is very precious. They really won't have a lot of time to spend with you, which is why you need to make sure you make the most of the time that you do have with your supervisor. You will have to learn to manage that relationship professionally for best results. Now, a theme through all of these challenges that I've mentioned so far, the challenge of project management, the challenge of communication, or the challenge of working with your supervisor, is that they are all your responsibility to address. The nature of postgraduate studies is that nobody else is going to come and do them for you. It's your PhD and your career, and you have to develop the self-motivation to tackle the challenges. You may remember me at the beginning of the session talking about the perception. The most challenges are challenges of knowledge and intelligence, but that the reality, in my opinion, is that the challenges are those project management, communication, and working with others. And I also highlighted the problem that they are not solved through conventional routes and that their nature is specific to every individual. And this may be making you even more worried, even less keen on starting a PhD. Well, there is some good news. And the good news is that this is what a PhD is really about. A PhD is a training and research, and these challenges are the challenges of research. But they are also the challenges of a myriad of other careers as well. And if you can improve your skills in these areas, you are in a better position and better prepared for your PhD and for your future. And you will be employable in academia and outside academia as well. And I managed to do it, and I think you can manage to do it too. Okay, that's the end of what I wanted to say. I just wanted to put my contact details up there, but we've now got probably about 5 minutes or so. I'm happy to take any questions, or if there's any points that anybody wants any clarification on, and then I think we're due to sort of close the webinar down at just about 1 o'clock. So please do type in if you've got any questions. This is slightly awkward now, no questions coming in. I'll give it just a moment to do, because I know it takes a little bit of while to type and for some of them to come through. I see Cindy's typing. So skills strategy for actually enrolling a PhD. I'm afraid I can only talk really from my experience here in Cambridge. However, I know in Cambridge that what annoys people is when people just sent blanket emails out or blanket applications to all sorts of institutions, or even if it's in Cambridge, I think in Cambridge you have to pay something like £50 per application. And the idea is it tries to make people think about what they're putting in the application. But I know that even when those applications come in, sometimes the application is, I want to come and do a PhD at Cambridge. And that will not appeal to anybody here in Cambridge. What people will want is somebody who's done their research and is passionate and committed about a particular area. So my recommendation would be have a look at a university's website, have a look at departments, have a look at the supervisors and topics that interest you, and then make some applications based on that, because it really shows you're more dedicated and you're more interested and you've done some of your research. So that would be my approach. Contact some supervisors first. See if they're interested, see if they're taking people on, and then make an application. I think the university will be much more impressed with your application. I'm just reading the question from Cindy. What if one realizes the expectations of supervisor and student differ only after they finally meet? Will it be too late to change? Well, my experience there is the sooner you do it, the better. But even if it's not early on, doing it at any point is a good thing rather than doing it right at the end. And it might be, I mean, just understanding your supervisor's point of view will put you in a much better position. But you might find that, I mean, supervisors, some of their opinions can be unrealistic and slightly strange. So sometimes if that difference can't be resolved, you might want to make sure that you've got good relations with a second supervisor. Certainly in Cambridge, we have a second supervisor system, and that's not a second boss, but it's another person who you can go and talk to. And sometimes relationships with supervisors do break down, but there's plenty of support available. Certainly here in Cambridge, for instance, we have a college graduate tutor who you can talk to independently, and there's also counselling services and things like this. But the thing is, I think dialogue, open dialogue, frequently is a good thing, rather than just not having these things out in the open. So do make sure they're out there and they're being talked about. Are there any other questions? I'm just keeping on time. We've got about another 2 minutes or so. Let me just have a look at that from Fozia. It says, supervisor is busy and time is precious, but what extent should he involve himself, herself, with the students? When you say involve, you mean, well, how much time commitment, etc.? I'm guessing that's what you mean. The thing is, it will be entirely different in every situation, because there are supervisors who are almost like international superstars. They have huge research groups, and you may very, very rarely see them. They might be out the country all the time. And often in those bigger groups, you might be supervised more on a day-to-day basis by a postdoc or someone else in the lab. And again, it's your responsibility. If you feel you're not getting enough contact time, again, you can raise that with the supervisor, but it might be that you need to offer alternatives. So rather than going to a supervisor with a problem, you go along maybe with a list of solutions rather than a problem. And the solution could be that there might be a postdoc in the lab who actually wants to develop the experience of what it's like to supervise somebody, because academics often want to go on and run their own group. I was fortunate enough to have that during my PhD. A postdoc took me under their wing, and they did a lot of the day-to-day supervising of me, and that's what really helped. So whatever the situation is, you've got to think about what the solutions are. Rather than being a victim, you have to think, well, how can I influence this situation positively? How can I make this work? Cindy says, how does a student say no when supervisor requests students do something which has nothing to do with their research? I've got two approaches to it. This goes of being assertive, because not taking on so much work because you're a soft target. If you say yes, you become a soft target and people ask you again and again. My two approaches are, the first one is an assertive way to say no, is to firstly, let me think. I'm just trying to remember what the approach is. First of all, to state, well, what the facts are, realizing why that person has asked you. The next thing is to, oh man, I'm struggling there. I can't remember it. Let me come back to that one. But I'll tell you, the second approach is approached by a guy called Marshall Rosenberg. And it's a technique called non-violent communication, which sounds a bit weird, but the idea is that oh, I'm struggling to remember what that one is now. You've really put me on the spot. First of all, you state what the situation is, what are the facts, what is the request that's been made. Then you state how that makes you feel. Then you state what the need is, and then you state what the request is at the end. And it usually opens a much more productive dialogue, I suppose, rather than being confrontational. So let me try and think what that first approach was. Maybe there's another question while I try and remember. Anyway, it's probably about time for me to go now. But I'm sorry I couldn't remember the exact answers to those questions for opening good dialogue, but I will follow up on those, and I'd be happy just to send a brief email with my suggestions like that. So please, Fozia, my email address is there. Email me, and I bet you if I spend 5 minutes, I can think of what those good strategies are for being assertive and using non-violent communication. Is that okay? Excellent. Well, thank you all very much. Sorry, my brain just dropped out there at the end. It's just a question of being put on the spot. I'm panicking a little bit. But I hope that's been a useful session for you. Please do get in touch if you need anything more. My Twitter account details are there, so please do. I often put useful things on Twitter. But it's been a useful session, I hope, for you. I've enjoyed it, and it's been really interesting for me to put some of my thoughts together in one place. So thank you all very much, and I'm going to try and find if I can log out now. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.